Maybe you like to go to theme parks with friends or family, or maybe you just like to see ride queues. But either way, you might be asking yourself, is the single rider line worth it? Today, I hope to answer that question here with you. Let's do it. Hey everyone, Dave K here today, answering your question, is the single rider line worth it? If you're at Universal Studios, there's a variety of attractions that have single rider queues, where you may be saying to yourself, well, if they have a single rider queue, this probably means the line is normally long, and probably means I'll save a lot of time by taking the single rider queue, right? So let's dive into that and figure out what your priorities are and address some of those single rider queues, how they can be managed, and if it makes sense for you. I want to reference two examples from my most recent trip to Universal Studios and Islands of Adventure. And here's how it went. It was at the end of the night, and I was making my way over to Dr. Doom's Fearfall. And I was telling myself, okay, this is going to be my last attraction of the night, because there's only about 25 minutes left here tonight. And I walk over to the ride and I see, okay, they've got a 30-minute queue. Let's go ahead and jump in line, and it is what it is. I guess we're going to be on this ride, and then we're going home. But as it turned out, when I got to the ride, I discovered they also had a single rider queue. And I spoke to the team member there and I said, hey, is it worth it for me to jump in the single rider queue this time around? And she said, well, I think you might want to go ahead and do that, especially since there's nobody in the single rider queue right now. And I asked her if the regular queue was worth it to see everything that goes on inside the queue. And it was a 30-minute wait. And she was saying, well, for 30 minutes, I don't think it makes sense versus just go walk on to Dr. Doom's Fearfall. And she was right. I walked up the stairs, and as soon as I got to the front of the queue for Dr. Doom's Fearfall, I walked straight onto the ride. The woman who was assigning guests to different vehicles immediately assigned me to one of those vehicles that only had 3 members in their party, and so I was able to ride the attraction immediately. I was on and off the attraction in 10 minutes. That gave me time to then head over to Hulk and actually end the night with the incredible Hulk coaster, which I was really, really excited for and thankful for. And, you know, another great ride to enjoy that night, especially that one, is a fantastic one. Now, after that 10 minutes on and off, I said to myself, all right, maybe this single rider queue is worth something. So I go ahead and walk up to the Hulk. I empty my pockets and left everything in the locker, as you do at the Hulk coaster. That's one of those rides where you have to take everything metal off yourself and leave it in the locker. And I went ahead and walked over to the front of the queue, and as I'm going through the metal detector, I asked the team member there, is there a single rider queue? And they said yes, and I hadn't taken the single rider queue at Hulk before. I'd been in the regular queue, which, by the way, is very cool for the Hulk. So if you haven't seen it and you're considering it, especially if the wait time's shorter, maybe you want to go in the queue for that one, but it's up to you. So I went ahead and got in the single rider queue on the Hulk. And this was a very interesting experience as well. I was standing with a variety of other individuals up there, and the line kind of went out the door a little bit. So if you're familiar with the single rider line, it kind of went through the entrance where you'd board the vehicle, kind of went back a bit, and then turned out the door. There's a little door that staircase sort of leads up over there, and it went about halfway. So the length was about half inside the door, and the other half on the other side of that turn. So the line was fairly long for a single rider queue. I was also listening as a couple of other guests were commenting on the empty seats on the whole coaster. We were watching the coaster go by, and occasionally you could see an empty seat on some of these Hulk coasters. I'd say maybe on average there was an empty seat per Hulk vehicle. Maybe it's 4 on this one and a couple that are completely full, or there's 2 on this one and a couple that are completely full. But in general, I would say on average it was maybe 1 or maybe even closer to 1.5 seats that were empty per Hulk vehicle. So that was kind of a sign that, uh-oh, what's going on here? When I finally made it to the front of the queue, I actually saw a party that boarded the attraction after me, that went through the metal detector after me, go in front of me onto the Hulk coaster. So even though I was in line for the single rider queue, which I imagined to be half or twice as fast as the regular queue, it actually wound up being a little bit slower than the regular queue. And I think this was just a new team member kind of trying to learn how to board both queues, multiple queues, and try to manage the fast pass, not the fast pass, but the Universal Express line and the standby line, and maybe kind of lost track of the single rider line. But I was on the second to last vehicle to board. Now that being said, that group that I saw go through security after me, they wound up getting on the same vehicle as I did. They were just further up in the vehicle. So I was not that much further behind than they were. They were on the same vehicle, just in a further forward row. So it wasn't a terribly slow experience, but it was actually slower in that particular case than standing in the standby queue. So this is an interesting question here, an interesting analysis of, is it worth it for me to stand in the single rider queue? And if so, when is it worth it? Now, I want to touch on when I walked up to both of those attractions, the listed standby time for both of them, Doctor Doom and the Hulk, was 30 minutes. So I was supposed to be waiting in line for 30 minutes for Doctor Doom, and then I was supposed to be waiting in line for the Hulk for 30 minutes. When I got to Doctor Doom, I walked on. It was straight onto the ride as soon as I made it to the top of the queue, and I was in and out of there in 10 minutes. When I got to the Hulk, it wound up being actually about 30 minutes in the single rider queue, which was very interesting. Again, you'd imagine standby would take longer, but it wound up taking just about the same amount of time, if not even a bit longer, for that single rider queue. So although the wait time was listed at 30 minutes, I had 0 minutes for Doctor Doom, and I had 30 minutes of a wait time for the Incredible Hulk coaster. So my first point towards is it worth it to go in the single rider line, the reality is it depends on the team member, and it depends how they're managing the single rider queue. It also depends on the length of the single rider queue. If there's nobody in the single rider queue, as long as the team member knows that you're there, you want to make sure that they realize there is now you in the single rider queue. But as long as they know that you're there, you should be on the attraction quite quickly. So if you can get a gauge before you go through the ride how long the single rider line is, especially if it's empty like that, that's always a really good thing to know and can give you a lot of insight towards whether or not it makes sense to go in that single rider queue. I read an article that said on average the wait time for the single rider line is about 50% of that of the standby line. So if you do some research or if you do some homework and you test that out enough, maybe you're in a 30-minute standby line, only takes 15 minutes in the single rider line. Or if you're in an hour-long queue, it might only take you half an hour on that single rider line. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of the research that I read. Now, I haven't been able to time that out myself, generally because I'm not in both queues at the same time, and I haven't had anyone test that with me yet, where they've stood in the regular queue and I've stood in the single rider line. But if I were to speculate, would that be correct? I think that's probably about right. And if you take my example of the Hulk plus Doctor Doom, I wound up waiting 30 minutes between the two of them when I really should have waited 60 if I stood in the standby line. So that is about 50%, although it was 0% for Doctor Doom and 100% for the Hulk coaster. Really interesting how it can be that different, but at the same time, it still averages out to about 50%. Now, another point that I have on this is it really depends on the attraction. Some attractions are, first of all, the queues are absolutely amazing. And some attractions, honestly, I feel like the queue is worth it and it's almost what makes the attraction. So depending upon where you are, I'll give you an example. For me, for the Fast and Furious ride, I feel like it was worth it to go through the queue because the queue was so interactive. They have a team member in there and they kind of manage the interaction with the characters you're going to see in the film. There's actually a couple team members in there, and the queue itself has a lot of cars in it as well. You hear a lot of that backstory. I feel like going on the Fast and Furious regular queue is worth it, again, just to kind of hear that backstory, get that build up, and really understand what's going on in the story, not to mention to get a great experience and get to see a great interaction and story told between that team member and between those characters in that film. Another component on the Fast and Furious ride, generally, the queue is very short. So to stand in that single rider line, does it really save you any time? Maybe it'll save you 5 minutes, depending upon how long the queue is. I haven't seen the ride too long, personally. Maybe it gets longer. But if it's only going to save you 5 minutes, it's worth it for me to go in the standby line because, to me, that ride is all about how that team member interacts with those characters in the Fast and Furious films. So depending upon your priorities, again, and depending upon the attraction, it can make sense to go in some single rider lines, but not in others. Now, I touched on it also depends on your priorities. Do you want to have all the backstory? Do you want to see all of the cool stuff going on in the queue? Or do you want to try to make sure you hit as many rides as possible that day? Maybe you say to yourself, well, I really need to hit these 4 rides. Maybe you do those 4 rides in single rider, and then you go back and everything else you do the regular standby queue because you want to see the queues as well. It really depends how you prioritize your adventure. For me, some queues are really worthwhile, and I would stand in those queues. And for me, for other attractions, I would say, well, this is a really long queue, and it's a really long ride, and I really just want to get on the ride, and I'm not too worried about the queue, so I'm going to jump in the standby line. It can depend for me as well. Another thing I want to touch on is not all rides have a single rider queue, or not all rides have a single rider queue up front. Something I've noticed to be very interesting with the Hagrid's ride, at least with the few times that I've been on it so far, is you have to get up to a certain point in the queue in order to then determine that you're a single rider and you're going in a single rider queue. So if the line is going all the way back, the single rider queue doesn't really start until once you start getting in that fenced area where you can actually see the attraction taking place, and then you can kind of self-elect for the single rider queue. So that's kind of interesting how you can't self-select for single rider until you're at that point in Hagrid's. But again, some rides have single rider, some rides do not. It really depends on the attraction. I would imagine it depends on how crowded it is, but it also depends on the seating arrangement and whether or not it makes sense to have single rider queue. So for example, the Shrek, at least in my experience with that Shrek attraction, I haven't necessarily heard a team member say, hey, anybody single rider here? But it's just a grand theater. So everybody gets seated and they fit as many people in the theater as they can. It's not like they fill up a theater with 199 people and they're like, all right, is anybody a single rider? Maybe on the rare occasion they do, but I would imagine generally that's not the case. So as I said, it really depends on your priorities. For me, would I take the single rider queue? Generally, I think I would, especially seeing as I've seen most of those queues at least once. I also have the ability to go online and see if other people have shared those queues, or a lot of those rides, I've been able to share those queues with you, and you can see me as I'm going through the queue. For example, I'm thinking about Cat in the Hat, where you can see all the fun stuff going on in the background behind me as I'm in that queue. Now, that's not necessarily a ride that has a single rider queue, but you can see a lot of these queues just by looking online and looking at different videos, and you can experience those. Whereas to actually experience the attraction, you kind of have to be there and you kind of have to do it. So generally for me, I would say yes, I'd elect for that single rider queue. That being said, on the particular attractions that I feel like it's all about the queue, then I'll go for those. So for example, for me, the number one would probably be Fast and Furious. I love that queue, and I feel like the wait time is never that long. So if you really do want to experience that attraction, I would say you may want to check out the regular line. Not to mention, actually, last time I went on that attraction, I was in the standby line. I was finishing off a smoothie or a milkshake, and I was able to drink that while I was in the queue, and then I was able to get rid of it by the end of the queue, which was nice to experience. So I was able to kind of eat or snack while I was enjoying the queue as well. So that's just another thing to consider as you're saying, do I want to go in the single rider line, or do I want to go in the regular queue? So in short, in general, I would say yes. Sometimes for me, I would elect out of the single rider queue, but generally, I would go for the single rider queue. Really depends on your priorities, depends on the attraction. And if you'd like a more in-depth analysis or you have a particular attraction in mind, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Do you agree with this review as well? Do you think it makes sense to generally go for the single rider queue, but it depends if you really want to see the queues or depends on a particular attraction? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much for being a part of this with me here today. I hope you enjoyed this review, right? Thinking about things differently, sharing my experiences with you as I go through these single rider queues and really thinking about, does this particular way of being make sense? How would I go about it? How do I recommend you go about it? Let me know if you like this sort of thing in the comments below. If you haven't already, for more fun adventures, food, and more, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to stay informed. And don't forget to check out my Twitch channel in the description below, twitch.tv/DaveK, for some regular gaming live streams, and my gaming YouTube channel on the end screen. You'll see that Dave K Media at the time of filming, so you can check that out for some gaming videos as well. Thanks so much for being a part of it with me, and I'm looking forward to sharing more adventures with you really soon. Until next time, play on. If you're at Universal Studios, there are a variety of different If you're at Universal Studios, there's a variety of several